The Zephyrian Academy for Xenobiology stood like a crystalline monument to academic pretension, its bioluminescent spires reaching toward 3 different suns, as if desperately trying to escape the gravitational pull of its own pomposity. For 700 standard cycles, this institution had served as the galaxy's premier center for the study of dangerous alien predators, a fact that its faculty never tired of mentioning, usually within the first 30 seconds of meeting anyone. The Academy's reputation rested on 2 pillars: its unparalleled collection of the galaxy's most lethal creatures, and its absolutely foolproof containment systems. The latter boasted quantum-locked cages that could theoretically hold a collapsed star, energy barriers that had never failed in recorded history, and safety protocols so comprehensive they required their own wing of the library to house the documentation. These systems had been designed by the finest minds in 17 different civilizations, tested by the most rigorous standards, and certified by no fewer than 43 galactic safety boards, which made what happened on that particular Threnday afternoon all the more amusing, in a cosmic sort of way. Professor Vextal Krandos adjusted his forearms in what he believed was an authoritative gesture, though it mostly resembled a Centaurian having a minor seizure. His purple-tinted skin gleamed under the lecture hall's artificial lighting, each of his 17 eyes focusing on different sections of his audience, with the practiced intensity of someone who had spent the better part of 3 centuries explaining obvious things to allegedly intelligent beings. "Today, my esteemed colleagues," he began, his voice carrying the sort of nasal undertone that suggested he had been breathing his own intellectual exhaust for far too long, "we shall witness a demonstration of predator-prey dynamics that will illuminate the fundamental principles governing survival across all known species." The lecture hall buzzed with the kind of excited murmuring that academic institutions seem to specialize in producing, that peculiar blend of genuine interest and performative enthusiasm that suggested everyone was very much aware they were supposed to be impressed by something. The student body represented a veritable menagerie of galactic diversity. There was Zektar the Crystalline, whose silicon-based physiology made him literally transparent when excited, currently resembling a nervous window. Beside him sat Vorthak of the Void Swimmers, her tentacles arranged in what passed for attentive posture among her species, though the slight phosphorescent glow suggested she was probably composing poetry in her head. The hive mind representative, going by the collective name of Unity Speaks for Many, occupied 17 seats and was having what appeared to be a heated internal debate about lunch. And then there was the human. Jasper Volt sat in the back row, a position he had claimed not out of any desire for anonymity, but simply because it offered the best view of the emergency exits. This wasn't paranoia, exactly more like the kind of prudent risk assessment that came naturally to a species that had evolved on a planet where literally everything was trying to kill you, including the plants. He was, by most galactic standards, remarkably unremarkable. Average height for a human, which made him shorter than most of the other students. Brown hair that refused to behave despite the galaxy's finest grooming products. Eyes that seemed to take in everything without giving much away in return. The kind of face that wouldn't stand out in a crowd, which was exactly the sort of evolutionary advantage that most apex predators never bothered to develop because they had never needed to. "The specimen we shall observe today," Professor Krandos continued, gesturing toward a containment unit that hummed with enough energy to power a small moon, "represents the absolute pinnacle of predatorial evolution. The Vorthak Death-Stalker, native to the shadow worlds of the Crimson Nebula, stands as nature's most perfect killing machine." Several students leaned forward with interest. Jasper continued sketching what appeared to be a small, fuzzy creature with an unusually large tail in the margins of his notes. 8 feet of pure muscle and malevolent intelligence, the professor elaborated, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of someone who had never actually faced down anything more dangerous than a particularly aggressive buffet line. Razor-sharp claws, capable of slicing through reinforced titanium, telepathic abilities that project waves of paralyzing terror directly into the consciousness of its prey, and most remarkably, a roar that has been scientifically proven to trigger the deepest, most primal fear responses in every sentient species we have tested. He paused for effect, scanning his audience with the smug satisfaction of someone about to deliver what he clearly considered to be profound wisdom. Fear, you see, is the great universal constant. Every species, no matter how advanced, no matter how civilized, carries within its genetic memory the knowledge of what it means to be prey. The Death-Stalker has evolved specifically to exploit this universal weakness, to reduce even the most sophisticated beings to their most basic survival instincts. Jektar's crystalline form shimmered with nervous energy. Vorthak's tentacles had stopped glowing entirely, suggesting she had abandoned her poetry in favor of paying attention to potential threats. Unity speaks, for many appeared to have reached consensus that this was, indeed, something worth focusing on. Jasper added what might have been whiskers to his drawing. The beauty of today's demonstration, Professor Krandos continued, clearly enjoying himself now, lies not in the creature's obvious physical capabilities, but in observing how its mere presence affects the psychological state of intelligent observers. Even contained within our quantum lock system, the Death-Stalker's natural fear-inducing abilities create a palpable sense of unease. You may have noticed your own fight or flight responses beginning to activate. This was, in fact, true. Several students were displaying clear signs of stress. Zektar was now completely transparent. Vorthak had coiled her tentacles into a defensive posture. Unity speaks, for many, was having what appeared to be 17 individual panic attacks simultaneously. Of course, the professor added with a dismissive wave of his uppermost right arm, some species are naturally more susceptible to these effects than others. The more primitive the evolutionary background, the stronger the fear response. It's simply a matter of how recently one's ancestors were prey animals. His 17 eyes briefly focused on the human in the back row, and his expression carried the sort of academic condescension that suggested he considered Jasper's species to be a particularly interesting example of arrested development. Jasper looked up from his drawing, which now appeared to be wearing a tiny hat, and met the professor's gaze with a sort of polite attention that suggested he was listening without necessarily being impressed. But I digress, Professor Krandos said, turning back to his primary audience. Let us begin the demonstration. I will now activate the transparency mode on the containment unit, allowing you to observe the Death-Stalker in its full, terrible glory. He touched a control surface with one of his lower arms, and the opaque walls of the containment unit gradually became clear, revealing the creature within. The Vorthak Death-Stalker was, admittedly, an impressive specimen. It stood upright on powerful hind legs, its body a study in predatorial efficiency. Dark scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Arms that ended in claws the size of short swords. A head that managed to combine the worst features of several different nightmares into something that was definitely not friendly. And the eyes. Oh, the eyes were special. They glowed with an intelligence that was clearly malevolent, scanning the lecture hall with the sort of calculating interest that suggested it was already planning how it would kill everyone in the room, possibly while humming a cheerful tune. The moment the creature became visible, the lecture hall's atmosphere changed dramatically. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The lighting appeared dimmer. Several students made involuntary sounds that fell somewhere between whimpers and prayers. The Death-Stalker's head turned slowly, those terrible eyes examining each student in turn, and with each gaze, its target experienced what could only be described as the sudden, absolute certainty that death was not only inevitable, but imminent, and probably going to hurt quite a lot. Fascinating, Professor Krandos murmured, making notes on his tablet while studiously avoiding direct eye contact with the creature. Notice how the specimen is already assessing potential prey. The psychological pressure you're feeling is entirely natural. It's your species' survival instincts, recognizing the presence of something that could, and very much wants to, kill you. Jektar had apparently decided that transparency wasn't transparent enough, and was attempting to achieve actual invisibility through sheer force of will. Vorthak was now glowing so brightly with stress that she was serving as an auxiliary light source. Unity Speaks for Many had reached the consensus that they were all going to die and had begun composing what appeared to be 17 different versions of their last will and testament. The Death-Stalker's gaze continued its circuit of the room, and when it reached the back row, something interesting happened. Nothing. The creature's glowing eyes fixed on Jasper Volt, and for a moment, predator and human regarded each other across the space of the lecture hall. The Death-Stalker's head tilted slightly, in the way that suggested it was trying to process information that didn't quite match its expectations. Jasper looked back at it with the sort of casual interest one might show when noticing an unusual bird outside the window. He even lifted his stylus in a small, polite wave. The Death-Stalker's eyes narrowed. It leaned forward, pressing its face against the transparent barrier, staring more intently at this strange creature that seemed utterly unaffected by the waves of terror it was broadcasting. Professor Krandos, oblivious to this exchange, was continuing his lecture. The remarkable thing about the Death-Stalker's fear projection is its universal effectiveness. In 7 centuries of study, we have yet to encounter a single sentient species that was when the quantum lock containment system decided to have what the subsequent investigation would diplomatically term a catastrophic failure of multiple avastigation and redundant safety systems. In less academic terms, the cage broke. The failure began with a sound like reality, hiccuping a brief, discordant note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The containment unit's energy barriers flickered, and for a moment, the Death-Stalker looked as surprised as everyone else. Then the transparent walls simply weren't there anymore. What followed could be generously described as pandemonium, though that term didn't really capture the full scope of the chaos that erupted in Lecture Hall 7. Jektar achieved his goal of invisibility by diving under his desk so quickly that he briefly broke the sound barrier. Vorthak launched herself toward the ceiling using a propulsion method that her species typically reserved for escaping underwater predators, forgetting that they were currently in an atmosphere. Unity Speaks for Many scattered in 17 different directions simultaneously, which was both impressive and deeply confusing to watch. Professor Krandos, to his credit, managed to activate the emergency alert system before diving behind his lecture podium, though his 4 arms became tangled in the process, and he ended up resembling a very frightened, very purple pretzel. Emergency lights began flashing. Alarms that had been specifically designed to be audible across 43 different species hearing ranges began wailing. Automated systems started sealing the lecture hall, while simultaneously calling for the Academy's security forces. And through it all, the Death-Stalker stood in the center of the chaos, taking a moment to appreciate its sudden freedom before deciding how best to use it. The creature's first instinct was to roar a sound that had been genetically programmed through millions of years of evolution to inspire absolute terror in anything with functioning survival instincts. It was the sort of roar that bypassed the conscious mind entirely and spoke directly to the most primitive parts of the brain. The parts that remembered when death came with claws and teeth and the only choices were to run, hide, or die. The roar echoed through the lecture hall with enough force to rattle the emergency lighting. It was a sound that contained multitudes, the promise of pain, the certainty of death, the absolute conviction that nowhere was safe and nothing could help you. It was, by any objective measure, a very impressive roar, which made the silence that followed it all the more noticeable. Because when the Death-Stalker's roar finally faded, there was Jasper Volt, still sitting in his chair in the back row, still holding his stylus, still looking at the creature with that same expression of polite interest. He hadn't moved, he hadn't flinched. He hadn't even looked particularly concerned. He had, however, added what appeared to be a small bow tie to his drawing. The Death-Stalker stared at him, its glowing eyes wide with something that might have been confusion. If creatures evolved for perfect killing were capable of such an emotion. It tried roaring again, putting more effort into it this time, really committing to the psychological warfare aspect of the whole experience. Jasper tilted his head slightly, the way one might when listening to a piece of music and trying to identify the composer. The creature took a step closer, its massive claws scraping against the lecture hall's floor, leaving gouges in the reinforced material. Its telepathic fear projection abilities were operating at maximum intensity, broadcasting waves of terror that should have reduced any rational being to a quivering, paralyzed mess. Jasper appeared to be considering whether his drawing needed a monocle. Now, it's worth noting that the Vorthak Death-Stalker was not unintelligent, quite the opposite in fact. Its species had evolved not just physical prowess, but considerable mental acuity. It had to be smart to be such an effective predator, and its intelligence was currently trying to process a situation that fell completely outside its experiential framework. Every creature it had ever encountered had responded to its presence in predictable ways. They ran, they hid, they froze with terror, or they died quickly while making entertaining screaming sounds. This was the natural order of things. This was how the universe worked. This small, soft, apparently defenseless creature was violating the fundamental laws of predator-prey dynamics simply by continuing to exist in a relaxed state. The Death-Stalker moved closer, its head lowered in what was unmistakably a threatening posture. Its claws extended further, catching the emergency lighting and casting shadows that would have been menacing if anyone had been paying attention to them. Its muscles coiled with the promise of explosive violence. Jasper looked up from his drawing and made brief eye contact with the creature. For a moment, predator and human regarded each other across a distance of perhaps 10 feet. Then Jasper did something that would be talked about in academic circles for the next several centuries. He smiled. It wasn't an aggressive smile, or a nervous smile, or even a particularly remarkable smile. It was the sort of polite, friendly expression that one might offer when acknowledging a neighbor across a garden fence. The kind of smile that suggested he found the situation mildly amusing, but not particularly noteworthy. The Death-Stalker's reaction to this smile was immediate and profound. It stopped moving entirely, its glowing eyes blinking in rapid succession, its head pulling back as if it had just encountered something genuinely unexpected. Because, for the first time in its existence, the Death-Stalker was experiencing something that its species had never evolved to handle: uncertainty. You see, the thing about apex predators, real apex predators, is that they don't become apex predators by being the biggest, or the strongest, or even the most vicious. They achieve that status by being the most adaptable, the most persistent, and above all, the most intelligent about risk assessment. And Jasper Volt was displaying the sort of calm, casual confidence that his species had learned to associate with something very simple. The complete absence of fear in the presence of a potential threat usually meant that the threat wasn't actually threatening to you. On Earth, this might indicate several possibilities. You might be larger than the threat. You might be faster. You might be better armed. You might have allies nearby. You might know something about the threat that rendered it harmless. Or, and this was the possibility that was currently causing the Death-Stalker's considerable intelligence to work overtime, you might simply be a bigger predator than the thing threatening you. The creature's head tilted further, its glowing eyes studying this human with an active intensity it typically reserved for analyzing the weak points of prey. But the more it looked, the more confused it became. The human was small by Death-Stalker standards, probably weighing less than a quarter of what the creature itself weighed. It had no visible claws, no fangs, no obvious weapons of any kind. Its skin looked soft and easily torn. Its limbs appeared to be designed for manipulating objects rather than inflicting damage. By every measure the Death-Stalker understood, this should have been easy prey. So why wasn't it acting like prey? The answer, of course, lay in several million years of evolutionary history that the Death-Stalker couldn't possibly have been aware of. Because while the creature represented the pinnacle of predatorial evolution on its native world, Jasper Volt represented something rather different, the end product of a species that had evolved, not as predators, but as something far more dangerous. Humans had evolved as persistence hunters on a planet where everything was already trying to kill everything else. They had developed not overwhelming strength or speed, but the ability to outlast, outthink, and ultimately outlive threats that were individually superior to them in every measurable way. They had learned to cooperate, to plan, to use tools, and most importantly, to remain calm and analytical in the face of immediate danger. Because panic got you killed, and humans were very, very good at not getting killed. The Death-Stalker took another step closer, and this time its approach was more cautious, more analytical. It was no longer simply trying to terrorize prey, it was trying to understand what it was dealing with. Jasper watched this change in behavior with interest, the way a biologist might observe an unusual specimen. He set down his stylus and leaned back in his chair, giving the creature his full attention. "You're quite impressive," he said conversationally, his voice carrying clearly through the lecture hall's acoustics. Professor Krandos wasn't exaggerating about the fear projection abilities. "I can feel you trying to activate my flight or fight response. It's actually quite sophisticated, much more refined than anything we have back home." The Death-Stalker's head snapped up at the sound of his voice. It was the first time anything had spoken to it in a calm, measured tone instead of screaming. "The roar is nice work too," Jasper continued, apparently unbothered by the fact that he was having a one-sided conversation with something that could have disemboweled him without noticeable effort. "Very deep, lots of harmonic complexity. Probably evolved to trigger fear responses across multiple species types. That's elegant design." The creature moved closer still, but now its posture was less aggressive and more curious. Its glowing eyes remained fixed on Jasper's face, as if trying to read some meaning there that continued to elude it. "The thing is," Jasper said, reaching into his bag and pulling out what appeared to be a small snack bar, "fear responses are really more about unfamiliarity than actual danger. Back on Earth, we have quite a few apex predators ourselves. Nothing quite like you, obviously, but similar principles." He unwrapped the snack bar with calm, deliberate movements, apparently unconcerned about the massive predator now standing less than 6 feet away from him. "There are large cats that can move faster than most people can react. Bears that can tear through steel with their claws. Sharks that can sense a single drop of blood from miles away. Spiders whose bite can liquefy your internal organs. Plants that can kill you just by touching them. Really, Earth is what you might call a high-threat environment." The Death-Stalker was now close enough that Jasper could have reached out and touched its scaled hide, if he had been inclined to do so. Instead, he took a bite of his snack bar, some sort of compressed fruit and grain mixture that managed to be both nutritious and remarkably unappetizing. "The thing about growing up in a high-threat environment," he continued, chewing thoughtfully, "is that you learn to assess actual risk rather than just reacting to threat displays. Threat displays are usually bluffing, you see. The creatures that are actually dangerous don't generally waste time trying to scare you first, they just kill you." The Death-Stalker's head tilted again, and for a moment, there was something almost thoughtful in its glowing eyes. "Now, don't get me wrong," Jasper said, raising the snack bar in a gesture that might have been conciliatory. "You're clearly very dangerous. Those claws could certainly cause some damage, and I'm sure you're quite fast when you want to be. But you're also intelligent, which means you're calculating risk, just like I am." He took another bite of the snack bar, considering his words carefully. "And I think you're starting to realize that attacking me might not be as straightforward as you initially assumed. Not because I'm particularly threatening, but because I'm behaving in a way that suggests I might know something you don't." The Death-Stalker's eyes narrowed, but not in anger, more like concentration. "The truth is, I don't know anything you don't know. I'm not armed, I'm not particularly strong, and I'm certainly not faster than you are. I'm just not afraid of you. And that's making you uncertain about whether killing me is actually a good idea." Jasper finished his snack bar and carefully folded the wrapper, putting it back in his bag with a sort of tidy efficiency that spoke of deeply ingrained habits. "Uncertainty is uncomfortable for predators," he continued. "Your species has probably evolved to avoid uncertain situations because uncertainty means risk, and unnecessary risk is how predators become prey themselves. You're starting to wonder if I'm actually prey at all, or if I'm something else entirely." The lecture hall had grown remarkably quiet. The alarms were still wailing, and the emergency lights were still flashing, but somehow the immediate sense of mortal danger had been replaced by something else entirely. The peculiar tension that arises when two intelligent beings are trying to figure each other out. "I'll tell you what I think," Jasper said, leaning forward slightly in his chair, his tone becoming more conversational. I think you're a very successful predator in your native environment because you've learned to read the fear responses of your prey. You've become so good at it that you've started to rely on it as your primary hunting strategy. But now you're dealing with a species that doesn't fear you the way your usual prey does, and it's making you question your own assessment abilities. The Death-Stalker's massive head moved closer to Jasper's, those glowing eyes studying his face with intense focus. The real question, Jasper continued, is what you're going to do about it. You could still attack me, of course. You'd probably win. You're certainly better equipped for physical violence than I am. But victory wouldn't answer the question that's bothering you, would it? You'd never know if I was actually unafraid, or just very good at hiding it. For a long moment, predator and human regarded each other in silence. The Death-Stalker's breathing was deep and controlled, its massive chest rising and falling with careful rhythm. Its claws flexed slightly, scraping against the floor, but the sound seemed more thoughtful than threatening. Then, slowly, the creature began to back away. Not in retreat, exactly, but with the measured movements of something that had decided this particular situation required further consideration. Its eyes never left Jasper's face, but the aggressive posture had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. Which was, when the security forces finally arrived. They burst through the emergency doors with the sort of overwhelming tactical response that the Academy was famous for. Energy weapons charged, containment fields ready, protective armor gleaming, and absolutely no idea what they were about to encounter. What they found was a lecture hall in complete disarray, with furniture overturned, emergency systems blaring, one very large and dangerous predator standing in the middle of the room, and a human student sitting calmly in the back row, apparently taking notes. The Death-Stalker turned to regard the security team with what could only be described as mild annoyance, the way one might look at someone who had interrupted an interesting conversation. The security officers, for their part, raised their weapons and began shouting instructions in 17 different languages, most of which boiled down to, "Nobody move." Jasper raised his hand politely. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with remarkable clarity. "But I think there's been a misunderstanding." The security team leader, a heavily armored Corvithian, whose species had evolved from something resembling a cross between a rhinoceros and a filing cabinet, turned several of his eyes toward the human, while keeping the rest focused on the Death-Stalker. "Student, you need to evacuate immediately," the leader barked through his suit's external speakers. "That creature is extremely dangerous." "Oh, I'm aware," Jasper replied conversationally. "We've been having quite an interesting discussion about predator-prey dynamics, actually. I think we've reached an understanding." The Death-Stalker, as if to confirm this statement, moved several steps away from the human and sat down on its haunches, adopting what was unmistakably a non-aggressive posture. The security team exchanged glances, or at least, the species that had conventional eyes did. The others probably exchanged something else, but the overall effect was the same: profound confusion. "Sir," one of the officers said carefully, "that creature has never displayed non-aggressive behavior. Ever. In 7 centuries of containment." "Well," Jasper said, gathering his notes and standing up from his chair, "perhaps it's never encountered a species that didn't immediately classify it as a threat. Sometimes, the best way to diffuse a dangerous situation is to demonstrate that you're not actually threatened by it." He walked toward the exit, passing within a few feet of the Death-Stalker, which watched him go with those glowing eyes but made no move to intercept him. "Besides," Jasper added, pausing at the doorway, "it occurred to me that a truly apex predator wouldn't need to rely on fear tactics to be effective. The fact that it was trying so hard to scare me suggested it might be more interested in avoiding conflict than initiating it." With that, he left the lecture hall, leaving behind a very confused security team, one deactivated containment system, and a Death-Stalker that appeared to be having something resembling an existential crisis. Professor Krandos emerged from behind his podium several minutes later, after the security forces had managed to guide the remarkably cooperative Death-Stalker back into a temporary containment field, His forearms were still somewhat tangled, and his purple complexion had taken on an interesting greenish tinge. What, he demanded of the security team leader, exactly happened here? The Corvithian officer consulted his notes, which were extensive and largely contradictory. Sir, as near as we can determine, your containment system failed, the Death-Stalker escaped and then talked with one of your students. Talked? Well, sir, the student talked. The creature listened. Then it sat down and waited for us to arrive. Professor Krandos blinked several of his eyes in sequence, a sign of deep cognitive distress among his species. That's not possible. The Death-Stalker doesn't talk with anything. It kills things. That's what it does. That's what it is. Yes, sir. That was our understanding as well. The professor looked around the lecture hall, taking in the overturned furniture, the gouged floors, and the lingering sense that something fundamental about his understanding of the universe had been called into question. Where are my other students? The security team leader checked his scanner. Still hiding, sir. Most of them appear to be under desks or in ventilation shafts. Unity speaks for many, is apparently having a collective nervous breakdown in the supply closet. Professor Krandos nodded slowly, his mind trying to process the implications of what had occurred. And the human? Went to lunch, sir. Said he had a fascinating story to tell his friends. Over the following weeks, the incident in Lecture Hall 7 became something of a legend within the Zephyrian Academy. The official report, filed after extensive investigation, concluded that the containment failure had been caused by a statistically improbable cascade of system malfunctions, and that the Death-Stalker's unusually docile behavior could be attributed to environmental stress factors affecting its normal behavioral patterns. Unofficially, however, the story spread throughout the Academy with the kind of embellishment that stories tend to acquire when they challenge fundamental assumptions about how the universe works. Within a month, Jasper Volt had supposedly stared down a dozen Death-Stalkers while juggling flaming torches and composing poetry. By the end of the semester, the legend had him arm wrestling the creature into submission while delivering a lecture on comparative xenobiology. The truth, as is often the case, was both simpler and more complex than the legend. Professor Krandos spent considerable time reviewing recordings of the incident, trying to understand what had actually occurred. What he found, much to his academic discomfort, was that his fundamental assumptions about fear, predation, and species psychology had been quite thoroughly challenged by an undergraduate student eating a snack bar. The human had been correct about the Death-Stalker's reliance on fear-based hunting strategies. Further research revealed that the creature's species had indeed evolved on a world where most prey animals possessed highly developed fear responses, and that their hunting success was largely dependent on psychological rather than purely physical dominance. When confronted with a potential prey animal that simply didn't respond to fear-based tactics, the Death-Stalker had been forced to fall back on more basic threat assessment protocols, and those protocols had correctly identified that attacking an unafraid opponent was potentially risky behavior. More significantly, the incident had forced the Academy to reconsider its understanding of human psychology and behavioral patterns. Subsequent research revealed that humans possessed an unusually sophisticated set of threat assessment abilities, largely developed as a result of their planet's remarkably diverse and dangerous ecosystem. Professor Krandos eventually rewrote his entire curriculum on predator-prey dynamics, though he never quite managed to recapture his previous level of confidence when lecturing on the subject. He also instituted a new policy requiring all containment system maintenance to be performed by at least 3 different engineering teams working independently, just to be safe. As for Jasper Volt, he continued his studies at the Academy with the sort of quiet competence that had characterized his entire academic career. He wrote his final thesis on comparative analysis of threat assessment strategies across species lines, which was politely described by the faculty as thorough and unconventional, though several professors privately admitted that they found it rather unsettling in its implications. The Death-Stalker itself was eventually transferred to a more secure facility, where researchers continued to study its behavioral patterns. Interestingly, it never again displayed the same level of aggressive behavior that had characterized its earlier captivity, leading to considerable speculation about the long-term psychological effects of its encounter with the human student. Some researchers theorized that the creature had experienced something resembling a crisis of confidence, having encountered a situation that fell completely outside its evolutionary programming. Others suggested that it had simply learned to recognize that not all potential prey items were actually prey, and had adjusted its behavior accordingly. The truth, like most truths involving intelligent creatures making complex decisions, was probably somewhere in between. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the incident was the gradual recognition within the galactic academic community that their understanding of human behavior and psychology had been somewhat incomplete. Humans, it turned out, were not simply another species of intelligent prey animals that happened to have developed technology. They were something rather more interesting than that. And in a galaxy full of creatures that had evolved to be perfect predators, having evolved to be perfectly unimpressed by perfect predators turned out to be a rather significant advantage. The Academy's admission standards were quietly revised the following year to include a new category of student: those species classified as apex persistence hunters. The category had exactly one entry in the database, but the administrators felt it was important to be prepared for future applications. After all, they had learned that assumptions about the fundamental nature of fear and predation could be rather dramatically overturned by the right combination of circumstances and a really good snack bar. And somewhere in the Academy's archives, filed under Incidents Requiring Further Study, there remained a single notation in Professor Krandos's careful handwriting. Note: fear may not be as universal as previously assumed. Recommend additional research into species that evolved in high-threat environments. Also recommend improved containment system maintenance schedules. It wasn't the most dramatic conclusion to what had become known as the Death-Stalker incident, but it was probably the most accurate. Because sometimes, the most profound revelations come not from great battles or dramatic confrontations, but from the simple recognition that the universe is considerably more complex and interesting than our assumptions would suggest. And sometimes, the most dangerous predator in the room is the one that doesn't look dangerous at all.